The bastard fired me on a Tuesday. Not just any Tuesday, but the exact Tuesday quarterly financials were due. Our biggest client was threatening to pull a $16 million deal, and our internal legal department was 3 signatures away from a contract breach that would make the Securities and Exchange Commission absolutely lose their minds. But sure, let us throw out the senior contracts manager, the one who actually wrote the indemnity language they were now relying on to save their skins. They did not do it next week, and they certainly did not do it gently. Instead, they dragged me into a conference room with glass walls on the 21st floor while the coffee crowd watched through the window like it was free cable television. But I am getting ahead of myself. Back then, the people who worked in the trenches called me the Clause King. Some said it with genuine respect, while others said it with a slight eye roll, as if I were the lunch lady of the legal department. I was always there, always unnoticed, and always somehow holding the entire place together. My official title was Senior Contracts Manager, and I was 14 years deep at a technology firm that looked like it was built entirely on buzzwords and combat, but actually ran on ironclad clauses and my obsessive attention to risk. I did not make noise. I made airtight agreements. I did not play table tennis in the break room or socialize with the product team during their innovation retreats. I lived in the fine print. While other people flirted with corporate disaster, I was over here threading liability needles like I was sewing a wedding dress. I loved it. No, really, I loved it. Give me a red pen, a 30-page draft from sales, and a cup of stale office coffee, and I was happier than a golden retriever in a tennis ball factory. And yes, before we go deeper, if you have made it this far and you are one of the 70% of folks who listen to stories like this while scrolling through emails or flipping a grilled cheese, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and toss us a like. Not for me. I have got my legal funds sorted. But the team behind this, they read every click like it is oxygen, and it helps keep the stories coming. Trust me, you will want to hear the rest of this one. Anyway, at work, I was the gray cardigan in a room full of pastel hoodies. I was never flashy, never messy, just always there. I was dependable. I kept our legal status compliant and quiet, which were 2 things no one in our office appreciated until everything started to burn down. Bradley sure did not. Bradley was the new chief operating officer, and he walked in like he had won the company in a high-stakes poker game. He had that startup swagger, always speaking in acronyms, always looping people in and parking problems until someone else solved them. He absolutely hated legacy staff. You could see it in the way he would say institutional knowledge, spitting the words out like it was a contagious skin condition. I was legacy, and that made me a threat. I was not a threat in the sword-fighting sense, but in the I know what you are doing and why it will explode kind of way. Bradley did not want guardrails. He wanted yes men. He wanted to sign things fast, flip partnerships like pancakes, and get quoted in technology journals before the 4th quarter. Meanwhile, I wanted to read the vendor clause that waived our rights to sue in case of intellectual property theft. Call me old-fashioned, but before Bradley showed up, life was weirdly peaceful. I would start my day with a mug of burnt coffee and a spreadsheet of open contracts. I liked the solitude of it, how every clause was a puzzle and every deal was a minefield I could diffuse with the right indemnity language. I had spent 14 years building a system where even if everyone around me lost their minds, the contracts wouldn't. I was the seatbelt in a car full of speed freaks. They did not like that I pulled the emergency brake sometimes, but they were still alive because of it. People forget in companies like ours. The person who writes the rules quietly becomes the most dangerous person in the building, but they just do not realize it until it is too late. Bradley blew in like an energy drink tornado with a 5 o'clock stubble and a Master of Business Administration degree from somewhere expensive but unaccredited. On his first day, he parked in the chief executive officer's reserved spot, slapped the receptionist on the back like she was his old college roommate, and announced to the entire office that it was time to turn this rocket ship vertical. In his language, that meant cutting the brakes, throwing out the seatbelts, and praying we did not nosedive into a mountain. You could practically hear the bandwidth buckle under his ego. He was charming in that fast-talking, spin you around and sign your house away kind of way. He had that false, humble charisma that made interns swoon and board members nod, the kind of guy who ended every sentence with "makes sense," as if your understanding was part of his genius. He did not just disregard legacy staff. He treated us like expired milk. The second he found out I had been here over a decade, he smiled like I had just confessed to still using dial-up internet. He told me that he liked fresh eyes and people who think differently, which of course meant people who did not remember how we got sued in 2019 for this exact stunt. Within weeks, he had started muscling through contracts like they were social media swipes. Sales loved him, product worshipped him, and legal was being left out of calls, pushed out of deal memos, and sent final drafts 3 minutes before signatures. It was like watching someone build a skyscraper without checking the foundation, using fireworks instead of concrete. A vendor contract landed on my desk, retroactively of course, and it did not just raise red flags, it raised sirens. It was a strategic licensing partnership with a technology firm in Vancouver that on paper looked like a dream. But buried in the boilerplate was a clause that outright violated our non-disclosure agreement with a major financial partner, Oak Ridge Capital. Oak Ridge was our primary funding source, having recently committed $50 million to our operations. The non-disclosure agreement strictly prohibited us from sharing our intellectual property or integrating with any external vendor that had links to their direct competitor in Vancouver. The Vancouver firm, Apex Dynamics, had a subsidiary that Oak Ridge was currently suing. If they integrated our software, it would trigger a mandatory disclosure under Securities and Exchange Commission Rule 10b-5. That is not just bad, that is federal court bad. I flagged it carefully and professionally. I sent a memo up through the legal department, copied compliance, and even tagged our usual risk consultant. I did not shout or make it political. I just outlined the liability like I had done 1,000 times before. 3 hours later, I was summoned to Bradley's office. Let me rephrase. I was summoned to his glass fishbowl throne room, where he liked holding impromptu meetings like a reality television villain. The guy was practically allergic to doors. I walked in, closed my folder, and sat down. He did not offer a seat. He just leaned against his standing desk, sipping something green and awful from a branded company tumbler. He asked if I did not like the deal without even looking at me. I explained that it violates 4 standing agreements and would require disclosure to the commission, meaning we could be in severe jeopardy. He held up a finger to silence me, calling me sweetheart, and saying that no one reads the fine print. He said it like he was doing me a favor, like we were in a 1960s sitcom, and I should be grateful he even acknowledged my concern. My vision tunneled for a second, not from rage, but from the sheer blinding stupidity of the situation. I stared at him, thinking about the massive legal implications of what he was proposing. The Vancouver firm had an active data sharing policy that would copy our clients' personal details directly to their servers. If we signed that contract, we would not only violate our agreement with Oak Ridge Capital, but we would also fail the basic requirements of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He told me that I was not sales, strategy, or even legal counsel. He told me I was support staff, and that I should stay in my lane and let the adults make the decisions. I felt a surge of anger, but I forced myself to remain calm. I could have exploded, but I did not. I just nodded slowly, because in that moment I knew something he did not. Bradley thought he was flying a rocket ship, but I had spent the last 14 years quietly building the escape hatch, and he had just strapped himself in. I spent the night staring at the ceiling fan in my living room, replaying Bradley's smug words in my head. Stay in your lane, no one reads the fine print. My jaw literally hurt from clenching it so hard. I was not angry because he had insulted me. I was angry because I knew the massive liability he was about to unleash on the company, and the board of directors had absolutely no clue. I was not just thinking about my job. I was thinking about the multi-million-dollar lawsuits that were going to rip through this office like a chainsaw in a bounce house. But because I am a man of protocol, I followed our standard operating procedures. First, I drafted a comprehensive compliance summary outlining the clear violations in that Vancouver vendor contract. I cited every clause, every regulatory disclosure risk, and cross-referenced it with prior corporate precedent. There was no emotion and no opinions in the document, just pure, cold risk analysis. I escalated it through our official channels, copying the legal department, compliance, and our internal risk management officer. I did not scream or cause a scene. I simply let the facts speak for themselves, and then I waited for their response. 3 days passed in complete radio silence. On the fourth day, I received a calendar invite with the subject line Contract Alignment Touchpoint. It looked harmless and boring, sent by Bradley's executive assistant as if it were just another routine meeting, except it was scheduled in the main conference room. On the 21st floor, the glass one usually reserved for high-level investor pitches and major product launches. When I walked in, there were already several people inside. Bradley was there, of course, standing with his arms folded like a police officer in a courtroom. 4 department heads were sitting at the table, pretending to look at their laptops to avoid making eye contact with me. Sarah, the company lawyer, was flipping through a manila folder, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else in the world. I stepped inside the room. No one offered a handshake, and no one offered me a chair. Bradley did not even wait for the glass door to click shut before he spoke. He looked at me and said they were terminating my employment, effective immediately, for breach of trust. I stood there in that cold, glass-walled room on the 21st floor, feeling more confused than angry. I looked Bradley in the eyes and asked him to clarify exactly what he meant by breach of trust. Bradley sneered, leaning over the table, and said that I had gone outside my scope, escalated confidential deal information, and abused internal channels to delay company progress. He reminded me that I was not a compliance officer or an attorney, but merely support staff, and that my constant redlining was creating a bottleneck for growth. Then he reached into Sarah's manila folder, pulled out a copy of my non-disclosure agreement, and slammed it onto the glass table like he was playing the winning card in a high-stakes game. He told me that the agreement included strict confidentiality and non-disparagement provisions, and that any further discussion of the Vancouver issue outside approved channels would be treated as a direct violation carrying personal financial liability. He smiled warmly, looking like he believed he had just shut me up permanently and solved his compliance problem in one clean sweep. That was the moment I looked at the document. It was indeed my non-disclosure agreement, but it was the specific contract I had written. Years ago, when our former general counsel, George Henderson, asked me to revise our standard agreements for senior staff. George wanted to ensure that anyone raising legitimate regulatory red flags would be shielded from corporate retaliation. That protective shield was written directly into paragraph 14D. I pulled a copy of my agreement from my folder, not the copy Bradley had, but my personal copy with highlighted yellow sections and my own notes in the margins. I slid it slowly across the polished glass table toward Sarah. I tapped my finger directly on the highlighted text of paragraph 14D, which was the indemnity clause. I read the words aloud, stating that in the event of termination coinciding with documented regulatory concerns or protected compliance escalation, the company agreed to assume full legal liability and defense costs related to the termination in perpetuity. With no financial cap, Sarah froze instantly. You could literally see the moment the realization clicked in her mind. Her face drained of all color, turning the shade of skim milk. She knew that I had initiated a formal escalation under California Labor Code Section 1102.5, which protects whistleblowers from retaliation. She also knew that the indemnity clause meant the company would have to pay for my legal defense against their own lawsuit. Bradley did not understand what was happening yet. He looked confused by her reaction, so I turned to him, calm as a Sunday morning, and told him that I had not breached trust. I had followed protocol, and now, by firing me, the company had breached indemnity. Bradley looked at Sarah, demanding she explain. Instead of speaking, she closed her folder slowly, as if the paper inside were radioactive. She refused to meet his eyes. I did not argue, I did not raise my voice, and I did not ask for a box to pack my desk. I simply turned around and walked out of the room, one foot in front of the other. The heels of my shoes clicked against the laminate floor like a slow, steady metronome. There is a quiet power in silence that loud, aggressive men like Bradley will never understand. The security guards did not even escort me out, which was their first major mistake. Back at my desk, I quietly slid my chair in, unplugged my computer mouse, and opened my company-issued laptop. Under the terms of my termination clause, I still had legal access to my device until the exit process was finalized. I synced my local storage, pulling every flagged memo, compliance escalation, and warning email I had ever sent regarding contract violations, securities risks, and questionable revenue structures. I was not stealing corporate secrets. I was simply recovering the metadata and receipts of my own work. It was 14 years of audits, red lines, and warnings, all time-stamped and sent through official channels. I shut the laptop lid, walked to the lobby, and handed my security badge to the receptionist with a polite smile, leaving them to face the storm they had just created. By the time I reached my house, my personal phone was already buzzing with text messages from former colleagues. The rumors were spreading fast through the office. People were asking why Bradley looked so incredibly nervous after our meeting, and why Sarah looked like she had just witnessed a tragedy. Some asked if I had really written the indemnity clause in our standard contracts. I did not reply to any of them. I wanted to let them wonder. Instead of answering my phone, I made a hot pot of coffee, booted up my personal computer, and spent the next 8 hours organizing my digital archive. I created structured folders for the indemnity clause, the ignored compliance escalations, the flagged contracts, and the suspected securities violations. I cross-referenced every single email alert with the corresponding contract timestamps. Every time I had raised a concern about a dangerous vendor clause, I linked it directly to the language that Bradley had rushed through the approval pipeline. It was like mapping a crime scene, and the pattern was undeniable. Bradley had not just made mistakes. He had actively deleted compliance officers from email threads, bypassed the legal department entirely, and forced agreements through by fabricating fake urgency. But the most disturbing part of the archive was Sarah's involvement. The metadata proved that she had been looped into several of these discussions. She had signed off on agreements where the risk assessment section was left completely blank. She was not just a passive observer. She was part of the system that allowed Bradley to run wild. In the weeks prior to my termination, I had sent her 3 separate emails outlining how the proposed Vancouver partnership directly violated California Labor Code Section 1100 2.5 by retaliating against staff members who raised concerns. She had ignored every single one, choosing instead to follow Bradley's lead. The next morning, I received a formal cease and desist letter via email from Human Resources. The language was clearly written by Bradley, demanding that I cease all communications regarding company matters under threat of legal action. I laughed out loud, flagged the email, and dropped it into my retaliation folder as another piece of evidence. The indemnity clause had already activated the moment they terminated me, and their attempt to intimidate me only strengthened my case. But my investigation took a dramatic turn when I began reviewing the final signed Vancouver contract that I had downloaded before leaving. I noticed something strange about the digital signature on the legal approval line. The metadata showed the signature belonged to Sarah, but the Internet Protocol address used to apply the signature did not match her office computer or her home network. In fact, the signature had been applied from a mobile device, registered to Bradley's personal account, at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. Bradley had forged the company lawyer's digital signature to bypass the legal bottleneck and force the contract through. This was a clear violation of California Penal Code, Section 470, which covers forgery of legal and financial documents. It was no longer just an internal compliance issue, it was a criminal offense. I knew that I needed professional representation to handle this. I reached out to Gerald Vance, a veteran employment litigator known in the industry for his aggressive representation of whistleblowers. Gerald was a man who did not smile unless he was about to win a case. We met at his office 2 days later, in a conference room that felt colder than the winter air outside. I laid out the entire archive for him, the emails, the forged signature metadata, the compliance warnings, and the cease and desist letter. Gerald reviewed the documents in silence, his eyes moving quickly across the pages. Halfway through the file, he looked up, smiled slightly, and told me that we had already won and that now we just had to make them realize it. Together, we drafted a detailed pre-litigation letter. It was a masterpiece of legal pressure, starting with the verbatim text of paragraph 14D and outlining the massive financial liability the company now faced for my legal fees. It documented the retaliation, the forgery under the penal code, and the clear violations of whistleblower protections. We did not send it to Bradley or Human Resources. Instead, we sent it directly to the outside law firm that represented the board of directors biz. I wanted the board to know exactly what their chief operating officer had done before he had a chance to cover his tracks. With the pre-litigation letter delivered, I decided to make one more strategic move. I contacted Sandra, a regulatory auditor I had worked with during our last external compliance review. Sandra was professional, thorough, and possessed a deep dislike for corporate executives who believed the law did not apply to them. I called her under the guise of a casual industry update, asking about the reporting thresholds for companies that discover forged signatures on documents submitted to federal agencies. Sandra was silent for a second before telling me that if I had evidence of forgery on compliance filings, I needed to submit an informal report immediately. I spent the afternoon preparing a neatly organized folder containing the metadata showing Bradley's unauthorized use of Sarah's digital signature, and I sent it to her secure government email address. Meanwhile, Bradley was completely unaware that the ground was shifting beneath his feet. According to my contacts in the office, he was telling the staff that I had been terminated for performance issues and that the cease and desist letter had scared me into silence. He was still strutting around the office, boasting about how the Vancouver partnership was going to double our revenue by the end of the year. But his confidence was short-lived. The board's outside counsel, a heavy-hitting law firm that absolutely despised negative publicity, received Gerald's letter and immediately realized the danger. They called an emergency board meeting for the following Monday, excluding Bradley entirely from the session. The meeting was held in absolute secrecy, with 9 silent directors sitting around a massive conference table while their lead attorney presented the facts. The attorney did not waste time with pleasantries. She explained that the company was facing unlimited financial and legal exposure due to paragraph 14D of my agreement. She read the indemnity clause aloud, pointing out that because the termination was directly linked to my compliance escalations, the company was legally obligated to pay for all of my legal expenses and any damages I chose to claim. She then revealed the evidence of forgery under California Penal Code Section 470, showing that Bradley had forged Sarah's signature to push the contract through. She warned the board that if this information became public, the company would face federal criminal charges and their primary funding sources would be void ab initio due to the fraudulent filings. The directors sat in stunned silence. One of them finally asked if they could simply settle the matter quietly. The attorney responded that they could try, but they had to realize that I held all the cards. While the board was debating their options, Bradley was pacing in his office on the floor below, still believing he was in control. He did not know that his badge access to the executive suite had already been flagged for suspension, and he did not know that the board now viewed him as a financial liability rather than a corporate savior. He had spent his entire career playing loud, aggressive games, but he had never played against someone who knew how to use the fine print to build a trap. The board meeting ended without a vote, but the atmosphere in the executive offices had changed completely. The lawyers were now running the company, and their primary goal was to contain the fire before it consumed the entire corporate structure. The first peace offering arrived at Gerald's office on a Thursday morning, delivered by a courier in a sealed cream envelope. The board was offering me a consulting severance package that included 4 months of pay, a mutual non-disparagement agreement, and a promise to provide a positive reference if I agreed to release the company from all future liabilities. It was a standard corporate escape hatch designed to make me go away quietly. Gerald and I sat in his warm office, drinking hot black tea while a cold autumn rain lashed against the windows. Gerald read the letter, laughed, and tossed it into the trash can. He looked at me and said that they were still trying to negotiate as if they had leverage, but they failed to realize that paragraph 14D left them completely exposed. He advised me to decline the offer without making a counterproposal, letting the silence do the work for us. I agreed. We sent a simple one-sentence reply stating that the offer was unacceptable, and then we went back to waiting. Instead of negotiating, I submitted my formal complaint to the Securities and Exchange Commission, attaching the complete documentation of the forged signature and the compliance violations. Within 48 hours, the Commission contacted the board, initiating an official inquiry into their recent filings. The news of the investigation spread through the company like wildfire. The legal department immediately ordered a forensic audit of every contract signed during Bradley's tenure, freezing the $16 million Vancouver deal and halting all new business operations. Our major clients began sending letters expressing concern about regulatory compliance, and one of our largest partners delayed a $12 million renewal, pending the outcome of the audit. SEC investigators actually showed up at the main office, requesting copies of the servers and interviewing accounting staff. Employees were whispering in the hallways, and the sales team was in absolute panic as the pipeline ground to a halt. The pressure on the board was now unbearable. They realized that Bradley's presence was destroying the company's valuation and that the indemnity clause meant they were paying for my legal team to systematically dismantle their defense. On the following Monday, the board called another emergency meeting, and this time, Bradley was summoned to attend. When he walked in, he tried to bluster his way through, claiming that the investigations were a temporary setback and that he was still the best person to lead the firm. But the directors were not listening. The lead attorney stood up and presented the forensic report, showing the forged signature metadata. She looked at Bradley and told him that he had committed felony forgery under California Penal Code, Section 470, and that the board was terminating his employment for cause, effective immediately. Bradley tried to argue, pointing to his contract, but the attorney reminded him that termination for criminal conduct nullified all of his severance benefits and stock options. One of the directors called for a vote, and in rapid succession, 6 hands went up, then 7, and finally, all 9 directors voted to terminate him. He was escorted from the building by security, his personal items packed into a cardboard box that looked remarkably similar to the one he had given me. He stood on the street in the rain, holding his box, while his former colleagues watched from the glass windows above. He looked small, defeated, and completely broken. I did not celebrate his fall. I did not write a long post on social media about my victory, and I did not gloat to my former coworkers. I simply let Gerald finalize our settlement, which included full back pay of $240,000, a substantial settlement for wrongful termination, and the complete payment of all my legal fees by the company under paragraph 14D. 3 months later, I used the settlement funds to launch my own independent compliance consulting firm. Today, my business thrives, and my very first client was the board of directors of my old company, who realized that the cheapest way to avoid legal landmines is to hire the man who knows how to spot them in the fine print. I still keep my old red pen on my desk as a reminder that the loudest man in the room is rarely the most dangerous, and that sometimes the quietest clause can bring down the entire house. Big thanks for watching, you sneaky seniors. Subscribe to keep the coffee pot brewing revenge. Your ex-colleagues won't know what hit them.